A good Erev Shabbos. Since Israel has been in the news a bit lately, and also because this coming week is Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel's 76th Independence Day, it's a particularly good time to take a look at our feelings about the Jewish state. We don't live there. We don't pay taxes or vote or fight in the army, although some of our members have and did, while others from KST have decided in recent years to go on Aliyah. Maybe, or maybe even most of us, have family members there. And even if we didn't, can we possibly say that there is a Jewish state? Never mind that half the Jews in the world live there, and we don't feel connected? Who would say such a thing? They say that modern Orthodoxy here in North America is the equivalent of religious Zionism in Israel. Nothing's really the exact equivalent of anything these days, but there's a lot of simpatico between attitudes and outlooks among modern Orthodox Jews here and Datiim, or religious Zionists, there. You're, of course, free to identify as either or both or neither. There's lots of options, and it's not clear what any of them mean exactly. But the intellectual and spiritual leader of modern Orthodoxy in North America continues to be Rabbi Soloveitchik, despite his passing some 31 years ago. He gave a talk many years ago that might be able to speak to some of what's going on around us in our times. He calls this talk Zionism and the Mizrahi. Mizrahi is the party or organization of religious Zionists, from the perspective of a raven head and a dove head. It's an interesting title, sort of. Although this talk is in Yiddish, he refers to them by their Hebrew names, a Rosh Yoina, der Kopf von a Toib, and a Rosh Oirev, der Kopf von a Verona, I think is the word for, that's the word he uses for the raven. Rabbi Soloveitchik describes himself as a two-headed creature. He says one of these heads, the head of the dove, is the true Mizrahi. Remember, the true religious Zionist. The dove is pure, faultless. The dove is beloved. We read in Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs, 2 weeks ago about Yonasi, Tamasi, my perfect dove. That's sort of a perfect ideology of religious Zionism, an ideal state of Israel, perhaps, possibly, probably run in accordance with Torah law. And it exists in an environment of peace. All its neighbors recognize it for the wondrous ideal that it is and feel blessed to have it in their midst, I guess. Then there's the other head, which is the ravens. The raven is not a kosher bird. It's tameh, it's impure, it's a bird of prey, and it's black as night on top of it all, says the Rav. The raven is not innocent, it's suspicious. It's stubborn and mischievous. It doesn't obey. How do we know the raven? Noah sends one out from the ark, Parshas Noach, and it flies back and forth. It's an oppositionist, a contrarian, always at odds with the world order, says Rabbi Soloveitchik. It's a revolutionary, a radical, and a zealot. That's a lot to ask from a bird. And he says further, and this is a quote, I inherited both these heads from Knesset Yisrael, from the Jewish people. On the one hand, Judaism connotes purity, faultlessness, self-sacrifice, and unity with the Jewish people. It's the embodiment of the worship of the heart, of the feelings of enthusiasm and ardor, or love and loving kindness. But on the other hand, Judaism preaches stubbornness, resoluteness, a critical attitude, clear and free thought and behavior, and avoiding misleading oneself. End of Rabbi Soloveitchik's quote. Maybe this two-headed approach resonates with some of us nowadays. We have a pure vision in our mind's eye of Israel. We have a heroic ideal of a state living up to its highest goals at all times. Then we have the raven's eye view, not like other nations, contrarian, critical. And says the Rav, this one is calling us out. But calling us out for not having enough pride in who we are, for not standing up for who we are, the Jewish people, the Jewish state. When he delivered this talk, as now, there was a struggle between secular and religious in Israel. There were controversies over who would get drafted for army service and how the state is supposed to make room for all the different stances and approaches and beliefs and politics and still maintain a kind of unity. And then factor in the wrath of most of the world for the Jewish state, for the Jewish people trying to defend itself. Europe now shudders in fright because of Russia. They're afraid that after Ukraine, they'll come after them next, and the sooner they take action, the better. And yet, Israel, 0.5% of the landmass of the Middle East, under attack now from three sides, has to show restraint and allow humanitarian aid and hold back on its declared self-defense objectives and suffer the criticism of half the brilliant university students in the so-called civilized world and rebuke from the UN and world governments. The Raven, says Rabbi Soloveitchik, is capable of answering a question that was posed by Achad Ha'am, which is it possible that the whole world is wrong and the Jews are right? And answering, it is entirely possible. In other words, are we crazy or is it everyone else? It seems entirely possible that it is indeed everyone else. That might bring us to where we are today. The beloved, pure, innocent dove of Israel is still there in the ideal, although it lives in a neighborhood with a lot of lowlifes. Israel perseveres for 76 years trying to be a light unto the nations, showing how you can have a participatory democracy with dissent, with a free press, and even protest, and even mass protest, and your government and your society won't be the worse for it. In any of its 30 neighbors' lands, protesters would be jailed, harassed, or worse. Dissenters would be stifled. In Israel, they become the next generation of leaders. Where does it come from? Where does the balance and perspective and humility and wisdom come from? Maybe some of that perspective and humility and wisdom we're looking for is found in Parshas Kedoshim, our portion of the week. As the name calls out to us, be a holy people, be different, be a nation unlike all the other nations, not just like all the other nations. Many of the 51 mitzvot in this rather brief portion this week speak very clearly to who we are as a people. You may find one or two or five of them elsewhere, but nowhere as comprehensively or completely as we have them. The last of them, the last few verses of Parshas Kedoshim, is Lo Selechu, do not follow in the practices of other nations. It's literally a mitzvah. It is an essential Jewish value and part of who we are, to be iconoclastic, to be countercultural, to swim against the tide. Time and again, we've had this feeling of, well, the rabbis never could have imagined this culture. It's so welcoming, it's so embracing. It's something about it's very Jewish, and they like us. Surely the rabbis didn't mean that we should buck the trend of this culture. So thought the Jews of Germany for 200 years. So thought the Jews of America for the last 250 years, or at least in the last century when we started being admitted into all the top universities and then getting tenure as professors and ultimately leading those universities. You may be interested to note that of the 8 elite Ivy League universities in the United States, in recent years, 7 of them were led by Jews, including Yale, whose president for the last 10 years, Peter Salovey, is a descendant of a Jewish family whose name you've heard recently. In fact, in this talk, Dr. Salovey's grandfather changed their family name from Soloveitchik. In our portion this week, we read of the mitzvah not to curse another, not to gossip about someone, not to stand idly by while someone's blood is being shed. How about a mitzvah not to hate another Jew? Yes, we had a mitzvah to love your fellow Jew, but here's a prohibition of hating, a separate prohibition in the same verse, not to embarrass someone else. And in the following verse, not to bear a grudge, not to take revenge, not to cheat in business, to leave the corners of your field for the poor when you harvest your crop, to let them come and take for themselves without shame or embarrassment, to leave fallen grapes in your vineyard for them too, to pay your workers on time, not to pervert justice in a civil judgment. A few years ago, we enjoyed a Shabbat, including a Friday night dinner with Rabbi Ilan Mazer, who's the head of Mizrahi Canada, the religious Zionist organization here. I'm sure you'll see him Monday night at the Yom HaAtzmaut celebration, and I hope everyone is planning to be there. Rabbi Mezer spoke at the dinner and he said, why is it when we talk about a Torah state in Israel, do people say Iran? Is that what we think of our Torah and its ways? That it's a repressive, authoritarian regime hunting down offenders? How did our beautiful Torah come to have such a bad name? That's a separate conversation we can have at the Kiddush. But you cannot argue against the idea that the Torah sets forth an ideal vision for a society of justice and honor and compassion, of shared resources, peace, shared responsibility, and coexistence. We have not forsaken that vision. Od lo avda tikvatenu, as the saying goes. You can argue that Israel has not lived up to the ideal, not yet, but you'd be hard pressed to argue that it's not trying. Hopefully, we are on the downside now of this awful conflict, and soon we'll celebrate the return home of all the hostages, the release from duty for so many of the soldiers and reservists, and if we're asking, why not hope for the best? The continued progress towards civil and enforceable peace in the region. It happens slowly, over time, as people wise up and painstakingly come to the realization that it's better for them, it's in their self-interest to come to the peace treaty table with Israel rather than fight it and continue to poison their own children's minds with hatred of Israel. As humankind has such a great capacity for horrors, it must have at least a similar capacity for good things, for holy things, like in Parshas Kedoshim. They should just stop trying to kill us and start learning from us. May the tide turn suddenly and soon. May all our surprises in the future be of good news. Shabbat Shalom.